Welcome, folks, to The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Every week, diving deep into the truth of Catholic social teaching and restoring all things in Christ.
The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Dr. Bud Marr, flying solo during the month of June. I'd like to rib Bo about, just traveling and relaxing in Europe, although I think he's transitioned now to the stage in his journey where he actually has to work. He's doing doctoral studies at an institution over there, and I'm pretty sure his wife has demanded that he spend some time now that he's in England researching and starting to write some of his dissertation. So blessings, Bo, on that work. Again, Dr. Bud Marr, I am Academic Dean at Mercy College of Health Sciences here in Des Moines. So if you're ever downtown, Six and Crocker, stop by and say hi. I'd love to introduce you to more of what we're doing at Mercy College of Health Sciences. Thank you, as always, to Imaging Ingredients. The great folks at Imaging helped to underwrite the show, so we're very grateful to them. I've been pretty happy recently with some of the rainfall that we've been getting in Iowa. I know Imaging, with the work they do with local farmers throughout the region, that's got to be a blessing in their eyes as well. So thank you to Imaging Ingredients. Today, I should say, we've got a great show for you. I'm welcoming on a first-time guest, but an old-time friend. So Dr. Stephen Lawson is Associate Professor of Theology at Newman University in Wichita, Kansas. He's been newly appointed there. So Stephen, as you'll hear from the show today, has had a fairly lengthy journey into the Catholic Church. He started in the Restorationist movement, sometimes called the Stone-Campbell Movement. So he's going to share some about what that looked like, the distinctive gifts of the tradition he grew up in, but how those gifts and his theological studies eventually led him into the Catholic Church. I think you're going to love this episode. Stephen will get into other things, teaching theology in the 21st century, Pope Leo's new encyclical, so you're going to want to stick around. This is Bud Marr with The Uncommon Good. We'll be back right after this. We're back with The Uncommon Good. Thank you for being with us. I'm Dr. Bud Marr, flying solo during the month of June as Bo Bonner is traveling in Europe. We're a little bit jelly, Bo. Thank you again to Imaging Ingredients for helping to underwrite the show and put some air beneath my wings. We're here today with Dr. Stephen Lawson. He is Associate Professor at Newman University in Wichita, Kansas. A new appointment, so new, you can't quite find him on the website yet, but I bet if you go there in September, you can go to newman.edu to learn more about what Dr. Lawson is up to. Stephen, thank you for being with us today.
Oh, thank you so much, bud. It's great to be here.
So we'll jump right in. Today, recently on the show, we've been interviewing different theologians and authors, and the thread in these conversations have been hearing some about how God led them into the Catholic Church. You and I have been longtime friends. I know it was kind of a circuitous journey for you. Where did that journey begin?
Oh, it is a long journey. So I've known you, Bud, since when you were in your PhD program. You were a few years ahead of me at St. Louis University. At that time, I thought I knew where I was ecclesiologically, but things have changed and developed a lot since then. So if I could go back, I was raised in eastern Kentucky, and I was from a very devout Protestant family. My parents, both of my parents, taught at a Protestant Bible college. I was in a small town in eastern Kentucky called Grayson. My dad taught, which was eventually for 17 years, at a school called Kentucky Christian University there. And I just grew up in and around the life of a particular Protestant tradition called the Stone-Campbell Movement. It was there that I really cut my teeth on theological questions, on learning the scriptures very deeply and meaningfully. And I had many profound experiences. I think many of your listeners have probably heard of, great experiences such as, vacation Bible schools and church camps and youth conferences. And I had many important spiritual events in my life, and people who taught me the scriptures and told me about Christ and God's love for us in Christ growing up. And I very much believed in this, and it was the heart of my life. I remember at one youth conference as a young man with my church, we attended, I think it was a high school youth conference similar to a Christ in Youth conference, if people have heard of those. And I made a decision on that night, I think I was 15, to dedicate my life to full-time Christian service, which was one of the things that you could do. You could make this big decision, which is kind of a very big decision to make at such a young age, but I was sure that this is how I wanted to not just spend my religious life, but also my career. And I stayed true to that. I studied at a Protestant Bible college in the Stone-Campbell Movement. I went to Ozark Christian College, where I studied the New Testament primarily. It was my major. Took an astonishing amount of exegetical courses and really learning scriptures. Took Greek as well as Hebrew. And I began to sort of feel a desire to learn something a little deeper, a little more than just scriptural memorization, just simple exegesis. And that really started me on the journey towards theology. Okay. There's a long story about how this happened, but largely due to the persistence of a couple of very persuasive admissions people, I was persuaded to apply to seminary. And so it's still funny now as a Catholic to say when I was a seminarian to my fellow Catholics, and they think that I was discerning for the priesthood, and that's actually not true. Sure. I went to a Protestant seminary to train to become a pastor or minister of some kind. I went to Emmanuel Christian Seminary. And while I was at Emmanuel Christian Seminary, I encountered for the really first time the broader Christian historic tradition. Particularly the professor there that was very helpful for me was Paul Blowers. He's a world-class patristic scholar specializing in mostly Greek patristic writings. But in his classes, I read people like the Cappadocian Fathers, St. Gregory of Nyssa, St. Gregory of Nazianzus, Basil of Caesarea. I read St. Augustine. And I began to thirst for the Christian tradition that I hadn't really known yet. I knew the scriptures really well. I knew them in their original languages. I knew them historically. But there was a huge gap between the world of the New Testament and our world today that I just didn't really understand very well. And I spent a lot of time in my seminary studies working on that field and falling in love with the Christian tradition. So for a long time, I thought I was going to basically become the next Paul Blowers. I honestly thought my vocation in life was to speak within my own Stone-Campbell tradition and teach other people about the broader Christian tradition. At the time, I talked a lot about being a lower C Catholic. That is, I'm Catholic, but I'm not Roman Catholic. Right. I'm part of the historic Orthodox faith. Kind of a mere Christianity thing in the language of C.S. Lewis. And that's the perspective that I was in when I started the PhD program at St. Louis University when you and I first met many years ago. And I lived in that world for a long time, trying to speak to the tradition that I had grown up in, that had loved me into existence, that had baptized me. Indeed, that had even ordained me. Now, it's not a sacramental understanding of ordination, but I was commissioned to teach the gospel by a congregation in the Stone-Campbell tradition. And so I felt a loyalty to this tradition, and I felt like my pedigree, being a kind of a child of the tradition, my parents being so deeply committed to it, kind of gave me a voice to speak, and that maybe God had commissioned me to sort of work in one small corner of the broader Christian tradition, and to help this tradition be a little bit more faithful to the gospel of Jesus Christ. So it was not a very exclusionary understanding of Christianity at that time. I would have never looked at Roman Catholics and thought of them as not Christian. Mm-hmm. I didn't come from a kind of Protestant fundamentalism that was as sectarian as that. But I would have expressed, disagreements on, various doctrines and points of authority at the time.
If I could get you to pause right there, if we could go back to the Stone-Campbell movement for a moment, because I think this is a sort of thing that many of our listeners will find fascinating, maybe a Christian tradition that they're less familiar with. And I think what jumps out to me, so Stephen, correct me if I say anything that's incorrect, but the Stone-Campbell movement is referred to as a Restorationist movement. And as I understand it, in that sense, they would even be sort of allergic to being referred to as another denomination, right? And there's a real strong sense of pushing for unity within that movement. What did that look like for the communities that you were a part of? And maybe, where did you start to see, I don't know if I'd say shortcomings, but come up against a wall when it comes to sort of like bringing that to full fruition?
Okay, those are excellent questions.
Yeah.
So nobody who worships at a church in the Stone-Campbell movement goes to a church that has the phrase Stone-Campbell on the sign out front. And so because of that, very often people, even within the tradition, within this particular expression of Christianity, don't even know that they are part of that particular expression of Christianity. So the phrase Stone-Campbell movement is one that historians of religion use to refer to the tradition that we're talking about here. But sometimes if they're referring to themselves, they might use the term Restoration movement. But the names that they would all call their churches are all very generic and very intentionally generic. Names like Church of Christ or Christian Church.
Okay.
The reason that they were so generic is because it was founded as a unity movement in the early 19th century, right at the founding of America, right in the decades after the Revolutionary War. As Christianity was spreading to what at the time was the frontier. So think of like Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky. That was considered sort of the frontier at the time. You had many Protestants bringing over sectarian divisions that were from the old world that didn't really make any sense. And so you would be in a sparsely populated American frontier, and in that situation, for instance, let's say you're a Presbyterian and you only take communion like quarterly. If you had the opportunity to take communion at that time, you had to make sure that you were at the right kind of Presbyterian church, not for one of the old Presbyterian churches. So, for example, there was a division between the old lights and the new lights, and the Cedars and the anti-Cedars. All of these, many of these go back to ecclesiological and political divisions in Scotland. And so it just didn't make any sense for people on the American frontier to continue being disunified from Christians that lived right down the road from them in a sparsely populated frontier. They said, why can't we just worship with these people who are also worshiping Jesus, are also, Presbyterian or Protestant at least. And so there was a desire let's just go back to the scriptures. Let's just become Christians only. That was sort of the motto. We're not the only Christians, but we're not going to call ourselves Baptist or Presbyterian. We're not going to use another label, which is why churches that are from this tradition use very generic terms, either Church of Christ or Christian churches to refer to themselves. So that's kind of where it came from. Now, if you're going to find a unity that is based upon a restoring or a return to just the Bible, there's going to have different kinds of expressions about that. Yeah. So one of the mottos of the movement was, one of the early mottos from one of the founders, Thomas Campbell. He said, where the Bible speaks, we will speak. Where the Bible is silent, we will be silent. Meaning that if it's clear, if something is clearly expressed in Scripture, then we can have a definitive opinion on it. Other than that, it can be sort of expressed. There's some freedom here. But as the movement developed over the last 200 years, interpretations of that motto varied widely. So there is a group of very conservative people who would say that unless it's explicitly stated in the Bible, it's a prohibition. So we can only do the things that are absolutely explicitly in the Bible. And there you will find some very, very conservative restorationist churches that, for example, will... I heard of one church that every Sunday when they would take communion, they would then sing a hymn and go outside.
Wow!
And then they would all come back inside because, of course, in the Gospels, I believe it might be John when in the Last Supper they sing a hymn and then they go outside. And so they're like, well, okay, we have to do that. We have to do exactly what the Bible says. And there's been debates about whether you're even allowed to have a kitchen in your church building because it's not in the New Testament and things like that. The very, very conservative approaches.
Yeah.
I didn't grow up in that kind of fundamentalist interpretation of that restorationist impulse, but you can certainly find churches that have that more fundamentalist. You know, our desire was to restore the New Testament church, and you'll say, well, we have done it. We are the New Testament church, and we're doing exactly what was in the New Testament. And so you'll even see sometimes churches that'll say, like on their on a stone outside of the church building, it'll be like, the Church of Christ, founded AD 33.
Nice.
And that's kind of their understanding of themselves.
Well, it's kind of fascinating how all this works out, and I'm sure you could do a whole episode on kind of like biblical interpretation within the movement and some of the conversations and debates there. But you say in your conversion story that you argued when you were still within the movement that there was like a sacramental or quasi-sacramental understanding of baptism, right? But that didn't necessarily extend to holy orders. Like, what was the scriptural sort of conversations going on around, I guess, the ordinances or like sacraments of the church?
Right. That's one of the unique things about the Stone-Campbell movement is they have often been known for their understanding of baptism. So the early Stone-Campbell leaders, especially Alexander Campbell, who was the son of Thomas Campbell, who I mentioned earlier, he argued very strongly that the New Testament baptism was more than just a sign of an inward spiritual conversion. It was itself the way in which God saved us. And so they didn't use the word sacrament to refer to it, but they were very insistent upon the role of baptism in the process of salvation. So they were very resistant to a kind of what we might associate with a more of a Southern Baptist or evangelical approach, which sees, the inner spiritual conversion, and then the baptism is the outward sign of that. They thought that, no, the baptism itself is really crucial. The baptism itself is how we say yes to Jesus Christ.
Okay.
And for them, they would definitely emphasize baptism is by immersion, because the word baptizo in Greek means to dunk, to submerge, to plunge. And so that's also been a strong emphasis on baptismal the mode of baptism. In addition, the Eucharist has had a very important role in the Stone-Campbell movement. The Stone-Campbell movement came out of a Presbyterian tradition that only had occasional celebrations of communion. And through their study of the New Testament, they saw that the Eucharist was actually central. Right? In Acts chapter 20, even with Paul present, it specifies that they met on the first day of the week in order to break bread. That was the reason for the meeting. And so very early on in the Stone-Campbell tradition, the Eucharist was celebrated weekly, every Sunday. Now, it was still often interpreted or spoken about in very more memorialistic terms or symbolic terms, but there are theologians within the Stone-Campbell tradition that found within both baptism and the Eucharist more sacramental resonances. And I discovered these or was sort of introduced to some of these thinkers during my seminary studies. One was a British Stone-Campbell theologian named William Robinson, who I did some work on in seminary. And he articulated a very sacramental view of these principles, of these practices, particularly of baptism and of the Eucharist.
Okay.
And I was really intrigued by this. It felt like it was aligning with the historic Christian tradition, and to find some people within my own tradition articulating this, I found an affinity for it. Now, I just need to remind you that, again, when we say we're a movement, one of the things is there's nobody who can kick you out.
Okay.
So there's not right. There's not a denominational headquarters. There's not a book of confessions that you have to swear allegiance to.
I need to find parties like that where no one can kick me out, but I get it. Yeah.
But because of that, there's freedom to I could articulate that I believe that these things were sacramental, and somebody else would say they're not sacramental, and nobody can kick each other out. And so I was pushing for the advocating for baptism and Eucharist to be, they're not just symbolic, they are real participations, right? To use Paul's language in 1 Corinthians, they are koinonia with the very body and blood of Christ. And that's what I thought I was doing, is sort of pushing that version of Protestant Christianity more aligned with a sacramental understanding of the Christian faith.
Well, we have...
In many ways...
Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
We have about 5 minutes before the first break, and I think where you're at now, my next question sort of brings us back to connecting some of these theological disputes with your journey. So you landed at St. Louis University, a Jesuit-run institution. And Stephen, what's funny to me is, like, every time I turned around at SLU, I felt like I bumped into someone from the Restorationist movement, and there was sort of a cadre of friends. You know, we were both friends with the Sons of Thunder, and it was almost like a groundswell of young theologians from the Stone-Campbell Movement who were landing there at a Jesuit institution. Like I said, we just have about 5 minutes, but could you share some, maybe like why that was taking place and how SLU ended up influencing the direction of your journey?
Yeah, I mean, there's some really interesting stuff there. I don't exactly understand why. You know, I went to this small Bible college, Ozark Christian College in Joplin, Missouri, and there weren't a lot of professors there who had PhDs from universities around. Most of them had master's or master of divinity degrees, and yet several of my classmates at this point have gone to PhD studies and have become Catholic. Quite a few, actually. I believe you interviewed Matthew Umbarger, my colleague at Newman, who preceded me, but attended the same Bible college as well, and ended up becoming a Catholic. But when at SLU, at St. Louis University, Alex Giltner and Jordan Wood both came from the same Bible college. I got friends with those guys going back to college days. Both became Catholic, both got PhDs. Jordan did a master's at SLU before doing his PhD at Boston College. And then we also connected with another Stone-Campbell theologian there at SLU, Alden Bass. I think there's just something in the Biblicist approach to the Stone-Campbell movement that raises questions that drives all of us to study history and to study the interpretive history of the tradition. And I think that perhaps even the desire for Christian unity has had an outsized influence upon all of us, because I think there was the thirst for real Christian unity and a thirst for richer liturgical practice. And I think that might have something to do with it, or maybe there was just something in the waters. But yeah, that for me, my time at SLU was profoundly formative. I think I came to SLU at the right time, studying the PhD in historical theology, and just took to it like a fish to water, just being introduced to the Christian tradition in a very deep and rigorous way. But I still saw myself as a Stone-Campbell theologian, but I increasingly was articulating more and more Catholic positions in class. And I would always give the answer that, the reason is because I felt that I was from a specific tradition and could speak to that tradition, and that God was maybe calling me to stay there. Mm-hmm. And after I finished SLU, and I persisted within my own Stone-Campbell tradition for a few years, trying to live out that vocation, it became increasingly clear to me that wasn't what God was calling me to. And it wasn't always strictly an academic or theological questions, although those were important. It was also family questions. And so as I was married and had children, the questions of conversion and teaching the faith to my own children definitely increased in importance. And I couldn't, once I became convinced of the truth of the Roman Catholicism, I really couldn't justify keeping my own children separate for the sake of some self-understanding of my vocation. It just didn't make any sense for me any longer. So that might be a bit of a brief summary of a long and tumultuous few years of my life.
No, thank you for that. It's all fascinating stuff. This is The Uncommon Good. We're talking today with Dr. Stephen Lawson. He's the newly appointed associate professor at Newman University, talking some of his journey from the Stone-Campbell Movement into the Catholic Church. When we come back in a moment here, we'll talk with Stephen some more about how he finally landed the airplane, what teaching theology looks like today, and maybe even dabble a bit with the Pope's new encyclical. So you're going to want to come back. Again, this is Dr. Bud Marr speaking today with Stephen Lawson. This is The Uncommon Good, and we'll be back right after this. We're back with The Uncommon Good. Again, this is Bud Marr flying solo. I've created a life-size cutout of Bo Bonner just to keep me company as he's traveling Europe throughout the month of June. Talking today with Dr. Stephen Lawson, associate professor of theology at Newman University. We've been hearing some about his journey into the Catholic Church. And Stephen, coming back from the break, since I have the mic, I was going to spring a question on you. I hope that's okay.
I'm ready.
You mentioned, so there's an article or a narrative that you've posted online. It's available through your Facebook page that describes some of this journey. And you mentioned, I think this is stepping back a bit, but even before your time at SLU, at St. Louis University, you started to engage the thought of Stanley Hauerwas. And I'd be curious to hear a little bit more about that. So for those who might be unfamiliar, Dr. Hauerwas is a renowned ethicist, probably the most well-known living Christian ethicist. And he was formative in my own experience, so I did a master's degree at Duke. And when I first was in Dr. Hauerwas's class, that's when I started to feel like a really strong tug towards the Catholic Church. Funny enough, because Stanley Hauerwas himself is not Roman Catholic, he describes himself as a high church Mennonite and I think attends an Episcopalian congregation. Stephen, for me, I think what was really important with engaging Hauerwas is understanding or thinking more deeply about the distinction between the church and the world. So Hauerwas has this provocative phrase where he says, the mission of the church is not to make the world more just, but to let the world know that it's the world. Maybe that piece of his thought wasn't so formative for you, but when you first started reading Hauerwas and discussing his work with friends, what did those conversations look like, and how did that propel you further towards the Catholic Church?
Oh, excellent question. I don't exactly remember who first introduced me to Hauerwas. It was certainly a friend, and it was during my undergrad days at Ozark Christian College. There's a little cadre of us, kind of Bible college misfits, you might call us. We weren't quite the clean-cut, straight-A students that were always picked to lead things. We were the guys who would sit around and argue, and sometimes late into the night talking theology. And we read Hauerwas kind of as this sort of almost like a punk rock theologian, as his criticism of American Christianity, including nationalism and consumerism and all of that. It really spoke to us. This radical ecclesiology, I think, is the way I would have articulated it then. This idea of radix, meaning a root, to return back to the living wellspring of allegiance to Jesus and what that means in the world. So I think he, and from that also being influenced by the writings of Mennonite theologian John Howard Yoder. Hauerwas was definitely always in my mind because I read a lot of his books and actually did a whole chapter on his thought in my master's thesis at seminary. And it was from him that I learned how to maybe do theology in a way that mattered. That he looked at the Christian faith and he looked at scriptures and he understood them not simply as relics of a past, but as resources for cultivating a radical transformation in the present, and not just a internal spiritual transformation, but a public, lived expression of Christianity. And so really, he kind of gave me the resources to develop an ecclesiology. I think a lot of Protestant free churches don't really have much of an ecclesiology. That is a theology of what the church itself is. And there's focus on conversion and upon Christ and what Christ can do for us. But what is the church itself as the body of Christ is sort of sometimes left to the side or not given a full consideration. And Hauerwas really helped me to ask questions about what does that really mean in a lived expression. And then the way in which he drew from the broad Christian tradition, right? He's quoting Thomas Aquinas. He's dealing with Karl Barth. And that gave me maybe a good model to follow for how to draw upon the wellspring of the Christian tradition. So, like yourself, I did find myself turning to Catholicism by reading this self-confessed high church Mennonite theologian. Yeah.
So you're like Hauerwas was influential. You're at SLU, I know, digging deep into church history. You mentioned in this in your conversion story online that the writings of like Eric Peterson and John Henry Newman were both formative. Let's move to the point where you're seriously considering like actual incorporation to the Catholic Church. Where are you at that stage in your life, and what did those conversations look like with family members and friends?
Okay. So it's very strange the way it happens. You know, I wrote my dissertation on this theologian who you mentioned, Eric Peterson. He is not very well known in English, but his years are 1890 to 1960. He was a Protestant theologian who became Catholic in the middle of his career, even though it cost him a very prestigious professorship. And he did so at a time in which lay theologians were not very common in the Catholic Church, and certainly not very common to have much of a job. So he did so at great personal expense. So I wrote about him and his academic journey, his ecclesiology, and its development, and especially his conversion. And I was actually asked 3 times in my dissertation defense, why aren't you Catholic, by my examiners? And at the time, I kind of tried to give the same answer that I'd been given up to that point, is that I felt maybe called to be speaking to a specific tradition. But several things happened that over a number of years that maybe questioned that very deeply. So I had been hired at a small Stone-Campbell Seminary in Austin, Texas, called Austin Graduate School of Theology. That institution, unbeknownst to me, was not doing well, and so I started teaching there. And my very first semester, the board had entered negotiations to be merged by another institution. And so during that merger process, it became increasingly clear that they were not going to be investing in the future of theological education at that campus. And at one point, the president of the acquiring university came to our campus to sort of explain how what they were attempting to do, which is to expand it from a seminary to a satellite campus of their university with other kinds of programs. And he had this quote that was really the moment for me that I realized I couldn't be a Stone-Campbell theologian anymore. So I have to thank him for this. He said that if they had incorporated a Master's of Marriage and Family Therapy or a Master's of Conflict Management, it was basically the same thing as a degree in theology. And I wrote the quote down verbatim because I was like, basically the same thing as a degree. How is marriage and family therapy, as noble of a profession as that is, how is that the same as talking about God? And I realized that it is the same thing if you have a very subjectivistic approach to Christianity, that Christianity is mostly a tool to accomplish certain subjective things. And I realized that I couldn't abide that definition of Christianity any longer. I had lived in that version of Christianity for a long time, and I even read many thoughtful theologians who had articulated the desire to help to make people more faithful, to preach the gospel in order to accomplish some particular ends, right? Some particular goal in mind. But then I realized that the reality, though, is either it is Christ or it's not. It's not something that we can just subjectively create or cultivate. So that really elicited a crisis that I was like, I don't think I can. I think that this has resulted in the fact that I can't stay. I have too much of an objective understanding of the sacraments to stay in a subjectivistic tradition. It's not our understanding of the sacrament that makes it a sacrament. It's Christ's presence that makes it a sacrament. And I think that's a really important ecclesiological point for me. Is I think one of the things I learned from Eric Peterson is he says, we can never experience what it's like to participate in the body and blood of Christ. That's not something that belongs to this finite world. It's something that we believe in objectively beyond our senses. It is not something that we receive and then kind of can cultivate or foster or make happen. It is something beyond us. And that distinction between an objective reality and the subjective approach to Christianity became increasingly clear to me. So I came home to my wife and I said, Emily, we have a problem. I don't know if I can say a Stone-Campbell theologian, but we have to pay our bills and we have a job.
Right.
And so we prayed together, and Emily herself had felt, she has a little different story, but she had been exposed to the Mass through her job teaching at a Catholic school and felt her own call to the Catholic Church. And so we decided, I said, either we decide that given the institutional merger and our uncertainty that we shelf this conversation for a future date when our lives are more secure, and then we come back and do RCIA then, or we just embrace the uncertainty of this period of our lives and do RCIA right now in the midst of this. And we decided to do the RCIA in the midst of job uncertainty, institutional merger, and all of the rest. And it became very, very clear as we entered into RCIA programs at St. Ignatius Martyr Church in Austin, Texas, that God was calling us to full communion with the Catholic Church.
Wow.
When we expressed that journey to our families, the response was mixed, I should say.
Yeah.
But over the years, I think many of people who originally in our families expressed a lot of hesitation have come to see, I would say, the fruits of the Catholic faith, not only in our lives, but also especially in the lives of our children. And I think that while they're not themselves Catholic, there's an appreciation there that wasn't there at first. I think that first, when they heard that we were becoming Catholic, it was a wound to them because it felt like we were separating ourselves from them. And I can understand that. And so when the essay that you referred to that I wrote, I posted on Facebook about why I became Catholic, it was answer to a lot of people in my background who had asked me about why I became Catholic. And I wanted to express what called us there, but also what appreciation I still have for the faith that I was bequeathed by my parents and by many teachers and institutions in the Stone-Campbell movement. There is a tendency sometimes the convert who becomes, who's always saying negative things about what he used to believe and what he used to do. And I don't look back and look down upon those people. I see a lot of goodness there, and I see in my own story a richness.
Right.
In fact, I would prefer even not to even call becoming Catholic a conversion for me.
Okay.
It was simply the next step in the conversion that happened from my baptism.
Wow.
So it was very important that, was not rebaptized. We Catholics are not rebaptized. My baptism was valid as a Stone-Campbell, as a young man in the Stone-Campbell movement.
Well, I was talking about this recently with Matthew David Weissman, a shared acquaintance friend of ours, and we were both talking on air about how it's difficult to articulate this to friends and family, but we both see our journey not as the rejection of something, but as like the full flowering of something. At the very least, if you end up with a lot of Protestant relatives and friends that become Catholic, it's great fuel for Thanksgiving conversations. Instead of talking about the Dallas Cowboys, you can get into ecclesiology and the sacraments. We have about 10 minutes left, and I had this kind of teaser before the second segment where we talk about teaching theology in today's world. You've had varied experiences, so you've taught at Catholic institutions, you've taught, within the Restorationist tradition, at different levels like secondary and higher education. This is broad, so take it wherever you want, but what are students like today? What sort of conversations are you having? What are some of the challenges, but also the promises and real joys of teaching theology in the 21st century?
Oh, that's a great question. So the last couple of years, I've really, I think, developed a lot as a teacher in the harsh realities of teaching high school. I taught for 3 years Catholic high school here in St. Louis, and we're moving to Wichita this summer to take a position at Newman. And I think being with high schoolers, you have to learn what really matters about teaching. They don't really care about the degrees and the pretension, and you have to connect with them at a personal level and show them what matters. And I think that's been really helpful for me to solidify what it is that we're actually doing as teachers of theology. Do I need my students to know what phrases like lex orandi, lex credendi mean, or do I care more about them living the faith? And so sure, I'll teach them some of the vocabulary and stuff, but I think when I first came into teaching, I focused too much on the cognitive vocabulary, names, terms, arguments, trying to rehash them, trying to say, can you restate the argument from the argument of first cause? And be persuasive. But, I still do that, but that is not actually the primary approach to what I do anymore in the classroom. My goal in the classroom is to have them encounter Christ in the texts and topics that we're studying, and then to see it in themselves. And one way that I've done this, I can maybe explain it, is in teaching confessions to high schoolers. Which is a challenge, I will say. I've taught Augustine's Confessions to high schoolers for a couple of years now. It's not easy because it's not an easy text to read, especially for people who are not used to reading text like that. But given time and space, the reward, it really does. It is a rewarding experience. So we read Augustine's Confessions slowly, and if you're familiar with that text, it tells the story of Augustine's journey from North Africa to Italy, his intellectual journey from kind of a paganism to a Manichaeanism to eventually Neoplatonism and then a Christianity. And we walked through this text very slowly together. We talked about it in terms of what are Augustine's key events in his life, what are his key friends, his key relationships, the key moments, the key geographies. And then I had the students do a series of journaling activities to write about their own key events, key geographies. Maybe you haven't journeyed from North Africa to Italy.
Yeah.
Maybe your journey, maybe the key geography of your life is, your grandpa's fishing boat, or, sitting at your, sitting on your mom's couch with her. Talk about your personal key moments in your life. And so we had the students sort of write their own journeys of their life, including their own, toile lege moments, their moment of pick up and read, their moment of enlightenment. And the students reacted extremely positively to this activity, not just as a project, but sort of as a way to approach the teaching of the faith. I think it's a really good model because I've always felt very uncomfortable as a teacher to assign a spiritual practice, like 20 points to go get baptized today.
Yeah.
No, I was like, no, I'm not going to do that. And so because of that, I often would lean more into like the strictly academic, like here, memorize these terms like eschatology and whatnot. But I think this new way I've approached it is to say, what I'm trying to get you to understand is wonder, is just to see the joy that is at the heart of reality. And if you see that at the heart of reality, then you should be able to see it in your own life too. So I think that's what we saw with Augustine was mostly Augustine as a frame for seeing God in your own life.
Okay.
Augustine was driven by these questions of where is God? Why is there evil? And he comes to realize that both of those questions are wrong. What kind of thing is God? Well, he's not a kind of thing. And why is there evil? Well, there actually isn't evil in a technical sense. And I have the students to kind of think about what questions animate their own lives. And I think that has been a very fruitful endeavor. And you realize that this generation that's coming up, they really do have deep theological questions. You just have to sort of pull them out of them. And I don't think it's helpful necessarily try to push them by making them just find a bunch of questions that they don't already ask. But the sheer fact of existence gives people questions. And when you give the students permission to really wonder about those questions deeply, I think Christ shows up. He shows up in the classroom, and he shows up in their papers.
Well, yeah. Well, we just have a couple minutes left, and time flies when you're talking theology. And so this is sort of a dangerous question to ask, just in the sense that there's so much we could say, and we'll probably have to have you back on a future date to fully unpack it. But I know in educational circles, there's a lot of talk right now about the place of artificial intelligence. Pope Leo recently published an encyclical on this, Magnificat Humanitas. Off air, you and I have talked, like we both had some time to read the encyclical. Was there one big takeaway or something that jumped out to you from that text that's been helpful to think about teaching theology?
Oh, that is a big question. I mean, I think that it is a really excellent text. I think this is a encyclical that is going to have real lasting impact upon the church. I'll say that. But I think what is so remarkable to me about it is the way in which it reads the signs of the times and realizes that what is going on about the way in which humans are being commodified by entities that are really historically strikingly new, these corporations and non-state entities that are controlling so much of the world today, that it really does elicit a crisis for us. And I think the clarity with which it sees that reality is profoundly effective. And then the emphasis upon returning to what it ultimately means to be human in a very concrete and localized sense, I think is absolutely essential. And so, in my opinion, I think what that means for theological education is it has to be a return to the person, not to the artificial. I don't believe that there's a way in which we can articulate, we can really incorporate artificial intelligence, certainly not in theological education, except for in maybe some very small ways, like, revising bibliographies or something like that. I don't see it as a very helpful tool, because the goal is not to produce a paper about Augustine. The goal is to have done the work, right? The goal is to have encountered the truth in the process.
Well, I think that's a great place to pause, because it's kind of a teaser, and listeners can go out and read Pope Leo's encyclical for themselves. But it's also an opening for me, Stephen, to invite you back to the show on a future day to get into that further. Thanks so much for sharing your story with us today. Fascinating stuff, folks. We've been talking to Dr. Stephen Lawson. This fall, he's going to begin teaching theology at Newman University in Wichita, Kansas. I encourage you to go out as the years go by and check out more of his work. He's got some things already online through the Newman Studies Journal and other publications. Stephen, thanks again for being with us.
Oh, thanks so much, bud.
All right, I really appreciate it. We'll be back right after this. We're back with The Uncommon Good. Those conversations always go so quickly. Thank you again to Dr. Stephen Lawson for taking some time out of his busy schedule to be with us on the show today. Thank you as well to Imaging Ingredients for helping to underwrite the show. I am looking forward to the time where Bo Bonner will be back with us, not too far around the corner here. It's been fun to fly solo, kind of stretching for me, but been grateful to have some wonderful conversations. Speaking of wonderful conversations, we're so grateful to you all for helping us to have those by giving some of your time, talent, and treasures. In terms of supporting the station, we certainly welcome your financial gifts, but your prayers as well. And you can join us in our prayer life here at Iowa Catholic Radio. We broadcast the Rosary on air at 4:30 a.m., 6 a.m., 10 a.m., and then later in the evening, you can end your day. 8:30 p.m., we have the Rosary. Also, 2:57 in the afternoon, we commemorate the Passion of our Lord by praying together the Chaplet of Divine Mercy. You can also hop on the Iowa Catholic Radio app to pray the Rosary anytime, anywhere. So I encourage you to download the app, not only for your prayer life, but also to see what's happening in and around the diocese. You can see that on the app, or go to iowacatholicradio.com to our events page, where you can find out how the Catholic radio station here in Des Moines is making its presence felt throughout all of central Iowa. On iowacatholicradio.com, you can also find ways to donate. Hit the donate button or call the station directly, 515-225-1150. And we welcome any ways that you can support what we're doing here at Iowa Catholic Radio. So grateful to be on the show. We're going to have Dr. Stephen Lawson back on. But as always, may Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, our lives, our families, communities, the Diocese of Des Moines, the entire country, the whole world, the whole kit and caboodle, as Bo says it. Please be back with us next week here on The Uncommon Good.
The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr is heard every week on wonderful Catholic stations like this one, and anytime on podcast.